College. He is a very eminent scholar and uh, very good teacher, as you can notice from the number of his students who are present here today. Uh, so let me welcome welcome Professor Chandran to this function, to this program. Professor Chandran will be talking to us today regarding keeping up with the genesis of theory on English in India. So I hope all of you have gone through the abstract that he has circulated. So let us all listen to Professor Chandran, and I also request all our students to actively interact with him. Please don't hesitate. Do ask questions in case you have any queries, any doubts, any clarifications. Please raise them with him after the talk. So I request Professor Chandran to for the talk.
Rohit, Rajesh, many friends of the University of Hyderabad, students of School of Letters, distinguished faculty. I'm rather embarrassed about the very highly flattering terms used to describe me. I love being a classroom teacher, so to the extent that I can give some help with regard to things that we normally discuss in class regarding not only theory but other things, I would be delighted to do that. So thank you for inviting me to talk to you this morning. Let me begin with the title itself, because I understand that you not only have English students but students who specialize in our language, Malayalam. So I don't take for granted that all the terms that I use will be familiar to all of us the same way. So I'll try to explain as I go along if there are technical terms, but let me begin with the phrase itself, keeping up with the Joneses. English students will easily recognize this phrase because this is a common phrase that English people use. Similar expressions are there in Malayalam as well, because it's a common practice that in villages and towns, everyone wants to be like other people. We don't want to be ourselves, but we look up to people who we imagine, not really true, but we imagine that other people are doing very well. So we want to keep up with them. So sometimes it is in terms of money, in terms of power, in terms of facilities, in terms of looks. So Joneses represent people with privilege, social privilege, basically. So maybe when they live in big houses, we want to be like them. We also want a big house. Not that we necessarily need a house, but we want our house to be as big as our neighbors. So there's a kind of competition in this. If they have certain facilities, certain access to power and things like that, we also run around and then create situations where we have access to power. So on. So that is the basic spirit of the title, keeping up with. Here the Joneses are people whom we generally call theorists. So there's various misconceptions about theory. That is what I thought we might discuss today. Some of them are plain misunderstandings. Some of them might be slightly true, but not to the extent that we believe the strength of theory to be. So we will slowly look at some of the features of theory in the light of what we understand to be theory. So there's always a gap between what something is and what we imagine that to be. Uh, so that's why in the short description I've given you, I describe after in 2-3 different ways. What does reading after something or somebody mean? One plain meaning is that after in time. Somebody has read something and we come after. It's always the case that we cannot always be on the same page or the same level always. Because as students we know, we were just talking about successive batch of students. So somebody has come to a place before, some people come after. And people who come after always believe that the people who have gone ahead of us or before us, they have had the better things. When we come, and it applies to people who are very young in the family as well. Our brothers and sisters or whoever had more wealth and power and so on long ago. But right now the family is not doing very well because by the time we were born, those privileges have already passed hands and we don't have anything now. So that kind of feeling we can have even when we study things. So this is, since you are familiar with romanticism, we know that this is basically a romantic kind of phenomenon. That the past is always better than the present. And you remember Shelley's famous lines, we look before and after and pine for what is not. So we always think that, oh, I have not had that privilege. So my brother, of course, had, or sister has had, or people who went before us, our parents, grandparents. We know that those people have had their problems, we have our problems. This applies to what we learn in classes also. It applies to degrees that we take from universities. Some universities or places of study improve. Some, of course, visibly decline. So some people believe that, oh, when I was a student, I've had the best of times. So at that time, studying in a particular place was great, but now it has become very ordinary. That again is not true, because at any given time when you look at any phenomenon, you always see strengths, you will always see weaknesses. Theory is something like that. And if you remember, theory was in ascendancy. Some people call it the golden age of theory and things like that. Roughly from 1960 onwards, 70s, 80s, the last decade of the 20th century, and probably the first 10 years of the 20th century. And then, as it always happens in social phenomena, you keep the door open because there's somebody waiting outside. Keep it open.
For the AC that I...
Right. So, we can always compare and then say that look, things were better then. So theory, in the first flush of theory, many people believed that this is something new. And as it happens with regard to technology, electronic technology for example, only some people had cell phones, some people had access to computers, and the first batch of people who enjoyed some of those benefits, they found it rather difficult, but they got used to it. So theory now is something that they've all got used to, and people do not anymore look at theory as something very difficult. But at the same time, something, of course, whatever comes from outside is exotic for us. And theory has that kind of feeling. So to keep things going, as applies to all movements in literature, new things come with certain added advantages or values. So theory also tries to do that, that's all. But now people are talking about old theory, people talk about new theory, sometimes people talk about post-theory. But one thing I want to stress is that there's the sense of after in all this. After, especially in time, in a successive sense. Something happened, and something after that. So the first readers are always from the West. In this, especially theory phenomenon, we understand that the first readers are always from the West. So naturally they become pioneers, they become champions, they become leaders, and they promulgate or they advance or they introduce new things. Now that does not leave space for other people, because once something, it applies to technology as well. It applies to many other things that come from the West. And India, of course, people who talk about the colonial period and post-colonial period always make this kind of an excuse, saying that, well, this has come from England, this has come from the United States, this has come from Europe. But by the time these things come to us, either they become very old or they're not quite serviceable for us. So that remains a complaint as always. So the West always will remain ahead of us. There's no way in which we can get ahead of the West. That's one thing. Presumably, they have read what was there to read first. So all the things if you examine even today, it applies even to our own literature when we read. See, take Malayalam writers there's a stiff competition among Malayalam writers. If you are reading contemporary magazines and journals, you will find that there's a very stiff competition among the writers. I don't think they are trying to tell us our stories. They are trying to tell our stories like somebody else. Why this happens, I do not know. Our stories, actually, the narrative is something that we should never compromise. We should never allow other people to speak for us. If you understand colonialism very well, one of the basic lessons of colonialism is that for a very long time, other people have been making narratives for us, or they have been taking away our narratives. I mean, the African writers like Achebe, East Africa, West Africa, most leading writers, they've all been telling us that our stories are being taken away from us. Our narratives are being appropriated and retold by other people. And that's how some of us are dark and some of us are evil. Some of us have to be taught. Some of us are illiterate. Some of us are uncivilized. So these narratives they can make only when they start telling our stories. So every story that goes from our land to some other land is a negative story. We are cast in dark light. Therefore, they say that, look, these people are like this. In one way, that explains imperialism. They are saying, look, these people are very not quite developed. See, look at the way they live. So there are several parameters they always cite in terms of health, in terms of circumstances, our less knowledge of ecology, or the way in which we maintain our forests, the way in which we maintain public facilities like roads, buildings, bridges, rivers. So they don't know how to manage the world, nature particularly. So even today, if you look at ecological literature, the West has begun to tell us, this is the way you should treat your own people, this is the way you should treat your animals, this is the way you should eat food. So look at the preponderance of Western food habits among us. We have been told, you eat this. Medicine again, Western medicine. And when we fall ill, naturally, we look for an allopathic doctor rather than native medicines and things like that. So the point is the bias has already been created by creating narratives. So think of theory as a narrative which people have very deliberately developed so that they always remain ahead. They give us a narrative and we follow it. Keeping people like us always eternally followers rather than leaders. That is number one. The second point regarding theory that we have to understand is that our reading always becomes mendicant, in the sense beggarly. Look at the craze for books from abroad. Look at the craze for publications from abroad. And since most of you are academics, you will know that even the UGC, even your universities and colleges and many places, they will say you need to have publications. Okay, fine. It's not enough if you publish in India. You should always have publications from other countries. That's the first step. But they don't clearly say. What they mean is you should publish in America. You should publish in the United States. You should publish in England. You should publish in Europe. How do they say that? They say that the sciences look at our scientists. Science is international. So if a publication has to be respected, you need to publish in, because the UGC does not have any other word to describe, they say Scopus Index journal. Hardly knowing what Scopus is. Or if you publish something, you show somebody, they'll ask you, is it the Web of Science? When I ask them, why should I publish in Web of Science? I am not teaching science. They have no answer. But it should be. So where is it listed? Where is it classified? How does anyone know you? I said, why should anyone know me? My students know me. All right. So we have absolutely no answers for many of the things that we pose to other people. That is how our reading becomes, mendicant is a very strong word, beggarly. Mendicant actually means beggar. A mendicant is a beggar. Our reading is mendicant. We beg that knowledge systems should give us sustenance, and that sustenance should come from abroad. Therefore, what does scholarship tell us? We must borrow. And when you borrow, every time you borrow, you must say that, look, I have taken this from X. If you look at some of the publication manuals, they'll tell you, this is the way to cite your passages, your quotations, and again, you can't submit an article without quotations. Why should the quotations be there? Because that shows that you have read all those other things. Suppose you tell them that I don't need to read all those things because I don't think this is what I have to say, that I have said it. No, that won't do. In scholarship, you should always quote. If you don't quote, at least you interpolate. So, if you look at the manuals for research, they'll draw a distinction between borrowing, quotation, interpolation. Interpolation is, as you write a sentence, in between, you weld in passages from somebody else, as X has said, as Y has said. So, eventually, people do not know what I have said. We keep saying that somebody has said, and we also in between say what I have to say, and that gets drowned in all this many. So, we are told what to read. We are told how to read. And then we are punished when we depart from any of these things. We are told, and teachers tell us, even I tell students, yes, this is not the way to write. So we already have a structure within which eventually even original thinkers cannot think because they have been drilled in certain patterns of thinking. Any departure from the standard, then again, the question of standard, I can go on talking about the standard for a very long time. Take language itself. It's the standard English or standard language which you should use. You should not use certain other kinds of. And eventually when you examine what the standard is, it's either American standard or British standard or Australian standard. By which standard they mean Western, finally. And because we don't follow certain standard procedure, our work is rejected outright or it is discredited. We do have publications or we do have papers, but and now in Malayalam journals also, if you open to see, Malayalam research journals, they follow exactly the same pattern. They say the title, after that you are supposed to write an abstract. And after that, Takol. It's a direct translation from keywords. What are keywords? Keywords for whom? So it's an easy way of understanding what the article is about. Abstract, again, people don't understand. Actually, in English, abstract means something that is not very absolutely clear. See? But abstract also has been made to be some in substance of what you have said, abstracted from the article. And people don't go that far. They just put a few sentences and build something that looks like a shorter version of. Because people are lazy, they have to sample about 100 odd articles. They can't be reading all the articles, so you follow the abstract and so on. And then there are, if you examine some of those Western journals, they also teach you how to write abstracts. And then they say, why should you write abstracts like that? They will say it is for more visibility. So now we are following exactly what the Western scholarship is trying to tell you about writing articles. You write articles not for your sake, not for the benefit of your students or the academy, but for visibility. So what eventually means is, unless you are visible, visible according to whom? Visible according to Western standards, you are not visible at all. It does not matter if, see, they don't even discriminate whether you are a teacher, and as a teacher you are visible. Never mind. You are not visible even to your students. They come and say all kinds of things and go away. The teacher is not visible, never mind. But as a scholar, you should be visible. That is why much of what we do is discredited. At best only a kind of addendum and addition. In the West, of course, nobody cares whether you have written something. I don't think they will even look up what you have done and things like that. Because they know that everything has been taken basically from their own scholarship, and they're very confident. And they have their own, see, if you have a press of your own, that's why Chinua Achebe once said, unless we write our own history, we cannot decide who has won and who has lost. It's certain, in most cases, the West wants us to believe that they have won. How? When they write their histories. We are not allowed to write the histories as victor and vanquished and display facts according to our own choice, and we always follow, even writing history, we have to follow a pattern, which is again imposed upon us by certain scholarly journals and practices. So what I am saying is, in this exercise, as readers, we believe that there is not much to add to the big theories. After reading all this, I don't even go into the larger question whether we understand all that we read. That's a very big subject, so I skip that for the time being. I assume for the time being all of us agree that we don't understand many of this. And we cannot complain to our bosses that we don't understand, because they are not quite interested in knowing whether we understand or not. We cannot complain to the West also. I don't understand what you're saying, because they couldn't care less. They will keep sending us material which you have to process and understand. So in this exercise, as readers, we believe that there is not much to add to the big theories. And it is no coincidence that the big theories, many of those big theories, they have names with B's, so I call them the big B's of theory. Blanchard and Vattel, Barthes, Baudrillard, Benjamin, Butkin, Bourdieu, Bloom, and a few other people whose names are different, but the big B's are still there. We read all of them. We understand a little bit of what they're saying, because their examples all come from their own lives. Some of them are like us, actually. They have also gone through suffering of them, but their examples naturally will be from their own society and culture, which we don't understand again. But then what we are doing awkwardly, that's the main point of this exercise. Why I wanted to talk about the Joneses of theory is that, not that we should not, please don't misunderstand me, it's not that we should not read theory, but we are reading theory the wrong way, and we are trying to ask whether is there any other way we can deal with theory. So in this exercise, the big B's tell us how to read, what to read. They give their examples. That's because they have seen everything first. Actually, those things are not the first, because in India there are similar problems. We are similar people. We go through more or less the same kind of experiences. Take, for example, the whole group of theorists we've talked about theory of strangers. Strangers are about us all the time. We have become stranger-making society all the time. And from the Vedic period, modern times, I think if you go through the literatures of various groups, of religions, of cultures, we'll find that we cannot study our society without a stranger. But there is nothing especially Western about it. This is a universal kind of thing which we can also understand. But the theory that we read is always Western. So we believe that the stranger theory, the theory of strangers, has come from the West. Actually, there's a lot of theory about the mlechas in India, for example. A mlecha actually is exactly, if you read Kristeva strangers within ourselves. Some parts will read like some of the essays that on mlechas that we have read. Mlecha literally is a person who speaks another language. That's all. But in modern use, mlecha is something that is discredited, something that is very bad, which is inappropriate, which we cannot accept. But that's not the original meaning. The literal meaning of mlecha is people who spoke Sanskrit looked upon people who did not speak Sanskrit as mlechas. Their languages we did not know. That's all. And this is the same rule that applies to, even today, to people whom we do not know. Because their language is not. For example, take Urdu. One of the main reasons why people who speak Urdu are identified with one religion or group of people is that a similar language which is Hindustani, people who speak that language do not want to accept these people as theirs. The same kind of thing happens to the British who went to the Africas. The African languages were called Mumbo Jumbo. So the first thing that you say about people whom you don't like is, I don't understand your language. Which is to absolve yourself of a responsibility of understanding somebody else. This very, very vile or very evil kind of technique we use against everyone. Take English, for example. The facility with English we have put first on our list. So people who speak English, so they have the privilege of disqualifying certain kinds of people from certain kinds of groups and things. So those people are not admitted. Think of the clubs in India during the British times. Admission restricted, always they used to display a sign there. And first thing they would say is, people who are not dressed like the British, black tie and coat and the Western dress. So if you want to enter the club, you need to have that dress. So that disqualifies some people. And then they put dogs on. You cannot come into the club with. So what they really mean is they don't want Indians there. Indians who do not speak English. So this attitude has permeated. Even today, if you can see some of the, even within universities, you find certain areas are restricted. If you don't have facility with English, you don't enjoy certain privileges in our society. So this applies to the stranger theory. The Kristeva's book, Strangers to Ourselves, is a very good book to read. So please take a look at it. Keeping the mlechas in mind, how we used to develop the theory of mlechas, people who spoke another language. Again, in Africa, people who, Ishmael Reed's novel, especially called The Mumbo Jumbo. Please take a look at these things. So this is a very common practice in the world. Not trying to understand, not trying to see the point of somebody speaking. And even the war that is going on now between Hamas and Palestine and Israel, for example. It's really surprising. They do understand the language very well, but they don't want to accept the fact that they understand them. So much so that they seek the mediation of an English-speaking country to end the war or to prolong the war. It's very clear, but then obviously you can't see it. Otherwise, why should the English-speaking countries mediate in that war? After all, Arabic is not very different from the other Yiddish that Israelites speak, because they all come from the same stock. They are brothers, actually. Abrahamic religions. Those languages are not very different. With some effort, they can understand. But not understanding the other with O capital, is very important, I think, in understanding theory as well. So theory would periodically project before you cases of the other. So that is one reason why we should continue to be interested, or we should invest in theory. So how far this? So we try to understand it from the other end, saying that theory is always difficult. Theory is not difficult at all. The only thing is that we somehow create the impression that the theorists have said everything first. Therefore, we have nothing more to say. So one way to approach theory is to disabuse ourselves of this kind of attitude. That they are not the first to say things. They are saying things in certain ways. So there's a kind of mutual distrust that the theories are very difficult. The theory also believing that the rest of the world will not understand, but let us make ourselves into a small club. So theory actually has put itself in a very peculiar elite place, from where sometimes it looks down upon people who do not know theory. So your papers are rejected if it is not, if the papers do not reflect theory in that sense. So you need to understand it from different angles. The sixth point is that in the state of affairs, what we say or write will have to be necessarily below par. That's the impression that theory creates. It cannot be below par because you are also human beings, you have also gone through the same experiences. The only thing is that if you approach theory this way, then theory will make no sense. It's below par according to theorists for two reasons. One, we never seem to get Western theory right because theory is in translation. It's a very big subject, so I will not go into details. There again, language plays a very important part. When the translators mediate, the translators are taking, see, please understand one thing about translators. They are like our brokers or agents who sell land or mediate in business. Why do they mediate? You want some land. Somebody has to sell land. A broker comes in between. What is his interest? Not because he is very particular that you should buy the land or the other person should sell the land, but he wants a small commission. Translators are basically commission agents. They want their benefit. That's why Spivak would translate Derrida in such a manner that only Spivak will know the real Derrida and give you the impression that every time you buy a book, apart from Derrida, Spivak also gets some money. And Spivak professionally makes, but somebody had to do it. And after that, of course, they have not allowed her to translate, Peggy Campbell, many other people do that. But in theory, the big role played by the translators, you need to examine. This applies to our languages as well. When somebody mediates, there's always some investment in that kind of business. They also want a small commission. But then we have to translate, and you recall Babel, the biblical story, and how they started speaking several languages, and the two ways of looking at several languages. If you look at several languages in India again as a kind of weakness, then there is no argument. As a matter of fact, as many languages that you have the strength. Look at again back to Spivak. Spivak's real strength is that she knows languages. See? So it plays both ways, but you should understand the politics of all these things in order to also understand which part of theory is adversarial, which part is friendly. So even in the English original, for example, if you look at Terry Eagleton or Harold Bloom or the Yale deconstructionists, we find it difficult to get English right. This is the fallout of theory. Actually, when the English people speak to us, we ought to understand because it's English. Even they have made the language difficult because of theory. So all the time making us feel that, oh, if you don't understand, you have come late. So please be on time. Please be on time like who? Like those people who write for us. So always making us feel guilty about not understanding things. So this has become the fashion of the academy now. Especially in English departments. We trade in this. I mean, I'm not blaming anyone because we ultimately become what we read. In English departments, I've been reading theory for a very long time. It has become so elitist without knowing that it has become elitist, and it has developed a kind of animosity towards regional languages so that we somehow make students believe, oh, if you don't understand English, that's because your regional languages are interfering. Actually, no. To know the languages, our languages, is is actually strength. Again, back to Spivak. Spivak, Bangla is as good as her English, and you put a full stop there. French, we do not know. She has also translated the French with other people's editors. And again, another thing that people generally don't recognize or seem to recognize is the role editors play in the publication of books. If you like a book, if it is well done, please don't imagine straight away that it is the author's work. There's always a team of editors, especially in the West, who work on the manuscript, make it readable in certain places, send back paragraphs badly written to the author, ask the author to revise, and send back. That's exactly what we do with our students as well. But students seem to resist it. Saying that, look, I've written and this teacher is, sending it back with all red pen marks and all that. What does he think of himself? Actually, the idea is to make language smooth, accessible. If language is not accessible, what's the point? So, academy has complicated the whole structure by making the subject itself more and more difficult. Partly it is the jargon, partly it's because of translation, partly it is because of misunderstanding, because our language will never measure up to the language of a theorist. So we read the language again and again and again. And then in between something falls off. And that crucial thing, although we test students at various levels, comprehension and things like that, there's not enough that we get from theory, partly because of translation. What a major theorist says in the Italian or German or French or any language, when it comes to us, it is already a diminished kind of text. Something has gone. It's like sending a message through somebody home. That messenger has to deliver exactly the same message. And if you don't get the stuff that you really want, you blame it on the messenger. See? Now, of course, there's a phone. You can also talk to people on the phone. But suppose you can't talk to somebody at that home. You want something from home when you are not there. You send a messenger. So our texts that we read in English departments are mostly English texts, translated by probably very competent English speakers. Understand one thing about translation. There are very, very few people whose languages are equal in competence when they translate. Either their French is better or English is better. In Spivak's case, of course, naturally, her English is better than the French. That's one of the reasons. After that, Derrida has not given much of his work to her, or the publisher is not interested in publishing more of Spivak translation. They have gone for other translators. This applies to Walter Benjamin. This applies to the major other theories that you read, the Yale theories who have translated little bit from here and there. All the translations that appear in journals like Diacritics initially, and those same translations redone, partly because for the American audience, the English has to be different and so on. So I think there's room for studying translations themselves in theory, and then the role the translation plays in our understanding of what transpires by way of theoretical communication. So we find it difficult to get English right because of another reason is our colonial reading habits and writing practices. In India, English is taught basically as a foreign language. Now, there's a lot of difference between thinking of English as one of our languages after a long time. I think in many African countries they have started taking French, Spanish or English. In Latin American countries, for example, Spanish, they have made their own. That's different from the mainland Spanish and so on. But in India, English continues to be a language of the colonizer, and we assume that your English is bad. The reason we have English departments in every college, every university. If a surplus of, it's good for English postgraduates, but the assumption is that English is a difficult subject. And look at the SSLC pass percentage. Now, of course, I am told in the papers that everyone gets a pass, but there was a time when students used to fail in two subjects predominantly. So one was maths and one was English. So the tutorial colleges always wanted English teachers and maths teachers. The assumption still is that English is difficult for us. Therefore, we need English teachers. And the English teachers are taught in a place called Central Institute of English and Foreign Languages, where the emphasis is on something called ELT, English Language Teaching, or English ELS, English Language Studies, or English as a second language, ESL. Now the assumption is that English is not our language, although they grudgingly say that, look, there is a whole institute for English, and if you look at I can't write it here, but if you look at the name of that institution, it will be very clear to you how they are ambivalent about English. Initially, when Nehru initiated the study of English in a big way in all universities, that institute was called English Central Institute of English, CIE, that's all. That was the first name. And then somebody said, we did not really have a center for English only. It's a waste of money if you teach only English. So why don't you teach some foreign languages also there? So it became, I think from the 70s onwards, it became Central Institute of English and Foreign Languages. And even today creates problem, because in English, you know that the conjunction and works forwards and backwards. So if you put other foreign languages along with English, either English is still a foreign language. You can't just say that English is our language, foreign languages are separate. So with that and, English and foreign languages is now both English and foreign languages, which means that English still continues to be foreign. So secondly, as we recognize, theory is translated, and any translation is received differently, received in quotes, because the so-called original text remains hidden or assumed as unknown and unknowable. So this can happen with our text as well. If you happen to read some of our own literature translated into English, sometimes we have to do that for professional reasons. The assumption is that the original, the other text is never known or will not be known, except perhaps very highly specialized people who know French as well or German as well. They don't look at the original text of Walter Benjamin, for example, what exactly he said. We have to rely on, and then we talk about, we classify translators as professional translators, widely used translations, authentic translation, faithful translation, all kinds of words we apply to some of those. So the assumption is that the original can never be accessed. Hidden, assumed as unknown and unknowable. The translator may have known, but not us. So this is another sense of after. So in all these maneuvers, we understand that we come only after somebody else. The translator may have known, but we can never know the original. We can never keep up with the Joneses in that sense. Whether theory is, who has enough knowledge of all these languages, even in Europe? The German knowing French and Spanish and the Italian and things like that, and English. And if you speak to some of the Germans, they have even a pathological distaste or dislike of English. They don't want to read English. So one part of theory is always under eclipse. They cannot read. They don't want to read. So there are larger territories of theory not speaking to one another. But all these things end up in India together. See, things from Italy, things from France, things from, and all mediated through English, American English, where we are not quite familiar with that kind of English. One of the reasons we find it difficult to follow, Jeffrey Hartman, for example, if we take his translation, put that beside Hollander, or put that beside some other translator, you'll find that some parts of theory begin to make sense. Bakhtin, for example, and they are the Slavic department. They are Russians knowing English, only then they can translate from Bakhtin, for example. Their English, of course, go through careful immersion, of course, who knows English as well, and then checked and rechecked and retranslated back and forth and then produced. So some theories appear to be more accessible compared to certain other theories. So if you examine, even among the Indians, you see that they absorb or take in certain kinds of theory from the third world countries, for example. So you look up, you can on your own test this by looking at some of the articles that have appeared in the old journals of the 70s and the 80s. Piecemeal appearance of theory in some of those journals, translated from certain, but not the complete, but some complete, I don't know, or whatever. See, whatever reasons. Again, in articles, you find that people who know the original languages, they use some of these original texts, although the article might be in English, and say translations might, to indicate that they have not followed the standard American translation, because the Germans are very, very sensitive about this. The text being translated by certain people for American audiences and so on. So that's various kinds of problems with regard to translations as well. So there are, I think, I do not mean to say everything is political in that sense, but there seems to be some kind of undeclared politics about certain theories not being available to us the way in which those theories are available to other audiences in the West or in the United States. So the point in all this is that no matter how hard we try, even with one theorist of your liking, we can never keep up with the Joneses in one sense. The original Derrida or his first translator Spivak, and later many others. Because we can always be faulted for not knowing enough of, I do not know what they will eventually say, because either they can say that you don't know French. The second thing they can say is, yes, you do not know French, but when you say that, yeah, yes, but I think I read Spivak, dermatology, they say, no, that won't do. Because how can you be sure that that particular passage has been translated properly? Third argument would be, yes, you have read Spivak, but that's not what Spivak says. Because your English is not quite up to that level and so on. So this can go on for a very long time, and we can always be at a disadvantage. The next thing about our lateness or our slowness relates to the natural kind of thing. You can attribute it to our colonial educational practices, perhaps the eternal slavery or dependence to which we are subject because of English. I've already mentioned CIFL, language policies, and the mistaken assumptions about English, whether we have been taught English as a language. It's a very common statement in many English departments. There are two ways of learning a language. You can either learn English, or in addition to that, you can learn about English. And the MA level, we begin to learn. That's why we also invest a lot of time in the history of English. It's a very good course actually, and that's the weakest course offering in most universities. Because without knowing so much of Old English, the assumption is that we cannot learn that particular. That's not true. A little amount of Old English and Middle English can easily be taught. And the sound changes, semantics, and the later developments after technology and things like that can be taught. That's a very good, but then we are not all colleges and universities are agreed on this. So whatever little we know is from guidebooks and things like that. So the point is, because of English, our disadvantage, but then there begins our real problem. So we are not very sure whether if we short of theory because of our English itself. The point is that we do, quote unquote, we do English awkwardly, even today. We think of English in terms of currency. And currency is again a mistaken notion for some people. We talk of currency, the global impact of English, corporate credentials. So as teachers of English, we have been told no, 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 our students do not want your kind of English. Don't teach them literature, but teach language. So there are so many of us, actually, in the initial stages when we want a job, we have to teach English in certain institutions where they don't want whatever English you think it is, but they only want what they call the bread and butter English. Just enough English for the corporate sector to be impressed by your knowledge of English, that's all. So currency is again a very, very crucial term. Although we talk of English in the world and the world in English and things like that, so our mistaken assumptions about teaching, the pedagogical practices. So much so that I've listed a couple of problems with regard to understanding English itself in very awkward manner in all institutions in India. The point is that we have not been able to get English into manageable focus. What exactly do we want? How can English for higher studies, people doing research in English and things like that, how much of English is required and how strong their English should be vis-a-vis our languages. We have never looked at that at all. Because repeatedly, because of Central Institute of English influence on us, we have been told our languages have been the problem. It's far from true. Your real strength of English should come from your languages. It will come. Basically, as a student, the learning level, any language will do, upon which you build. So, not knowing English correctly or getting into the manageable focus so that our syllabi are not revised. Superficially, we do certain things. You put one text, take away another, and there again, that phrase is very important, keeping up with the Joneses. Most of us look up to some university. There again, the kind of hierarchization. We somehow believe that in JNU they do it like that. In some other university they do it like that. So therefore, that's not the way we should make a syllabus. So our syllabi are never revised, keeping in view our requirements, our students. We do not conduct good tests, for example. We never know our students, what English they want and for what purposes. When they are revised, we add more and more English mediated texts, theory to it, not knowing what the theory is going to do in practical senses. So look at even that course called the literary criticism and theory, for example. We somehow believe that it's a seamless flow from criticism to theory. Theory, it always existed in the past as well, but the designated theory with capital T and things like that. So there's no thinking that goes on. And in most cases, we have left it to other people to make syllabus for us. And we look at the American syllabus or the British syllabus, something like that. And then we tell our students, this is what you should be reading. The basic text, of course, we don't read. Then the next problem, English is for us. We have not quite understood what English is doing for us, even in understanding theory. Imagine English to be a kind of prism through which the whole world of ideas is still refracted to us. English is not straight away giving us anything. If your English is working very, very well, the evidence should be, it should act like a prism. If there's one ray of light entering, it's refracted in many ways before our eyes. That should be the idea behind our syllabus. That's never done. We never give choice again to students with regard to the theory text that they ought to be reading. Now the reason we do cultural studies again, it's a very good subject to ponder at some time. Why do we do this? Again, because of the Joneses. Somebody is doing it. So we have to do it. Hardly realizing what our culture is and how we will read it. This has been going on in our country for a very long time. And culture is not something that came up yesterday because of some other cultural theorists who said that. For example, a very good example also in English we have. What I am saying has already been said in beautiful terms by Stuart Hall. But then we don't make Hall part of our syllabus. See? English for us is again a medium there to do our culture. That's one of the reasons why we do culture. See, the point is that we are not against culture studies, but we're only against doing culture studies the wrong way or the awkward way. The reason we do culture studies the English way, and that is not our way of doing it. Our understanding of culture is basically through Anglo-American books, which we need to read. I'm not saying that we should not read that, but to know that may or may not be the reason for us to do culture. How they are doing it, and they have very clear purpose, very clear objective. Why certain kinds of cultures are dominant, and why those things have to be understood and learned. But we are just borrowing some of those texts and then say these are basic readings and you read them. So our understanding of culture is basically through Anglo-American books and models, despite. I do not know, I've never seen in any of the English syllabi a very interesting person called D.D. Kosambi. Many of his essays deal with culture, but not the way in which culture is understood by the West. But he has written all those things in English. So these things are, those essays are called exasperating essays. A very interesting collection. Maybe you have a copy in your library, take a look at it. But we never prescribe, we never read our own people talking about culture in certain ways. For example, we don't even have a good bibliography of work in culture available in some of the old 19th century journals in India, like the Modern Review and so on. A large number of articles appeared, not only about India, Indian culture, Indian regions and things like that, also Asiatic researches, Western views on culture by the side of Indians researching and culture in a very broad sense. About agriculture to begin with, as Raymond Williams always reminds us, culture is not what you think it is. It begins with agriculture and various forms of culture. About plants and animals and the world around us. Many Indians have written alongside the British in Asiatic researches. So we need to do some homework regarding our culture studies business here, but we don't want to do that because it's very easy to prescribe some standard textbook where they have collected all these essays. So our understanding of culture is basically through Anglo-American books and models. Despite all these people I'm going to mention, they have warned us about culture. What culture is, what culture is not, and how we ought to understand our culture. Stuart Hall is one, I've already mentioned. Said has mentioned this. Gloria Anzaldúa has said this. Audre Lorde. All these people have nuanced our understanding of culture. And those essays do not appear in the mainstream. But we have other essays prescribed. So we need to think very hard about it. And last of all, we should also ask why English departments should do it. That could be done in our other departments as well. That's why we have the awkward problem of Malayalam culture being studied in English departments, where Malayalam departments have absolutely no interest in those things. And somehow, everyone wants to do those things in English, so that the degree is in English, so that the jobs are in English, so that you can apply for them. And that's what the awkward situation when, things, phenomena, which you can largely call pop culture or ordinary culture or large high culture, elite culture, it's all discussed in English departments using a kind of inadequate English. Actually, we don't have words for all the phenomena that in standard English dictionaries. But we grapple with that. We do a kind of saying translation of those things and then say that we are doing cultural studies. So more attention should be paid to some of those things. Again, the impulse is that we want to keep up with the Joneses because cultural studies is a big subject and there are media again studied in awkward ways. And finally, I think I want to conclude with that phrase called takes after. When our reading takes after, the questions we ought to ask ourselves, those questions are not quite well formed or reformed. Our English still remains what we want it to be. And then there seems to be a resistance to uh, the other kind of English we need to develop for our own thinking. English still happens to be in the possession of a few, and the few would comprise certain departments of English, certain institutions. English is identified with certain media houses and things like that. So we stand in the way of English meaningfully conversing with our bhashas and vice versa. We do not allow a decent commerce between our languages and English. Actually, I'm making this statement to the School of Letters because this is where possibly this can happen because you have the languages here. And the African commerce, people do meet, people do discuss, and we can have a common syllabus for the School of Letters. So we stand in the way of English meaningfully entering the Bhashas in a peculiar way. I do not know what syllabus it could have. Translation, of course, is one, but not in a very elementary or what in a very basic sense of one language becoming another. One language does not become another that easily. If you look at certain kinds of translations, I think you will find it because very rarely do we get texts of that kind, but we need to look for those texts. One text I would cite is, one that comes to my mind now, is the translation of Raja Rao's Cat and Shakespeare, a translation of which Ayyappa Panikar has done. The importance of that is that it's a Malayali story told in English by a Kannadiga. Now, when you translate that into English, does it read like a Malayalam story? And what is English doing there? But English does English plays a very important role because the title itself is Shakespeare, Cat and Shakespeare. And what is Shakespeare doing there? Maybe for some time you will try to wrestle with problems of that kind, and then you begin to see some problem with regard to the kind of English, with regard to the Malayalam Panikar is using, trying to replicate the kind of awkward Malayalam a Pai uses. See, this is a Kannada Pai speaking Malayalam and trying to capture that in the Malayalam translation, which Raja Rao has not been able to replicate in his English book. See how complicated the whole thing becomes. There are very few texts of that kind. So try to look for texts of that kind where languages somehow, and in Europe and America and all that, you will find, especially in African American writing, you will find number of texts of that kind. Morrison, for example, Alice Walker, for example, also that lady called Paula Marshall, Poets in the Kitchen. Take a look at the book. See, that is where exactly languages somehow enter without permission into the consciousness of some other speaker, and something happens. Of course, Borges comes to mind. There are so many writers of that kind. So, nothing is sacrosanct, and the boundaries are not clearly marked. And that is the understanding of language I think we need to have. If we want to come out of this complex of the Joneses, that the theory is that, and then it is for only some people. Yes, they are playing a game, and where they have made their own. The theory, as you know, has done very well for some people, and for some other people, of course, many people like us have been left out of it because if you do not know theory, you can't write papers. I've already mentioned that particular thing, why our papers become not quite acceptable because X is not mentioned, and you will really find politics of it also. If you want to publish an article, if you do not cite certain authors, certain texts, certain phenomena, they won't accept. So the politics behind publications, and UGC has absolutely no idea. The CARE journal, the CARE listing, these people have absolutely no idea. They don't want to listen to us. The point is that you cannot publish if you have. So the better way is to institute a journal culture here. We have to develop our own journals. And the one journal that was being published from School of Letters, I don't know where it has gone. We need to revive it. We need to have more writing of that kind. Of course, the initial attempts will be rather questionable and dubious and things like that. But then eventually something will happen when languages, apart from people, interact. So there is hope. So we do culture studies again awkwardly by imposing English protocols when we study our culture. And of course our families are not Western families. Our gender is not in that sense engendered in the West. Food, politics, literacy, art education, cinema, TV, all these things we can do. But with an awareness of what we are doing and how we understand culture and why we understand culture this way and not the other way. And that requires a lot of collaboration, a lot of hard work, sitting together rather than quarreling, and not hierarchizing things. English, of course, is one of our languages now, or if it is not, how to make it ours with the presence of, or in the presence of our own languages. All right, I think I should wind up at this point and invite some questions. So thank you for patient listening. If you have questions, you can ask them in Malayalam as well to the extent possible. Thank you.